So we'll go over the overall anatomy of the brain first. We're going to identify structures and then look at additional structures within. So there are four main regions of the brain. The largest one being cerebrum, okay, which is comprised of two hemispheres, left and right. And we know that we actually have lobes that make up these hemispheres, which we're going to take a look at. We have the frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and insula lobes. In the center of the brain, underneath cerebrum, we have a few other structures, okay? In the center, we have diencephalon, which is comprised of a number of structures, but we're going to focus on the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Inferior to cerebrum and diencephalon, we have the brainstem, which is comprised of the midbrain pons and medulla oblongata. And then inferior to the occipital lobe on the back of the brain, we have cerebellum. For the outer surface of cerebrum specifically, we have a number of gyrations or ridges, which we will call gyri. An individual one is called a gyrus. And we have a number of depressions in between these gyri, which we call sulci. So these are the depressions between the ridges, okay? We're also going to see some fissures on the brain. We have a fissure that actually separates between the two hemispheres, left and right. And a fissure is a much deeper sulcus. This is kind of the brain, right? We can see those gyri through here, and then in between those shallow depressions are called sulci. And we can see a number of different structures. Again, this PowerPoint is posted for you to look at with your own time. Just a few pictures, okay? So when we actually open up the brain, okay, and we're going to be looking at what kind of cells or what kind of matter is what we're going to call this, it's comprised of. It's important to note, we already looked at the neurons, right? So we know that the cells of the nervous system include neurons as well as those neuroglia. If there is a portion of the brain where the neuron cell body exists, so the cell body with all those dendrites attached, we call that gray matter. And for our cerebrum, typically gray matter is found in the cortex, okay? The cortex being the outer portion or superficial portion of the brain. White matter, on the other hand, is consistent of those axons coming from those cell bodies, and it's white because those axons are myelinated. And those ones, typically for cerebrum, for our brain, white matter is going to be found in the medulla or the innermost portion. We're going to see a difference when we look at the spinal cord in a later chapter. And this is kind of what we're looking like. The outer cortex here, okay, cortical region of cerebrum, we are seeing that we have a lot of gray matter, which is consistent of these neuron cell bodies, often called cerebral nuclei. And then in the center, okay, we have this white matter. That's because of the axons that are myelinated. And again, this center portion is termed the medulla or the innermost portion. Alrighty, just have a few pictures. So before we actually get into those structures, we do want to talk about some protection that we have for the brain and the spinal cord. We'll talk about the spinal cord protection, which is the same as the brain when we get to the spinal cord, but let's focus on the brain for now. We know that overall we have protection from the skull bones, okay, protecting the brain, but there are also a series of layered tissues surrounding the brain, which we call the meninges, which we'll look at in a minute. In addition, we also have cerebral spinal fluid, which is cushioning and nutritive to brain tissue. And we have the blood-brain barrier. And if you remember, one specific cell is helping us with our blood-brain barrier from our neuroglia category, and those are astrocytes, which we'll mention again. For the cranial meninges, so essentially the layers surrounding the brain, okay, we have pia matter, arachnoid matter, and dura matter. Pia matter being the deepest, it's actually touching the brain, arachnoid matter being in the middle, and dura matter being on the outside, most superficial. Pia matter, okay, is the innermost one, touching the brain. It's made of areolar connective tissue. And this is going to be very nutritive for the brain. There's lots of blood vessels here. Arachnoid matter is a little bit different. It's called arachnoid matter, and we'll see a picture in a minute because it makes these projections that look like spider webs. Those projections are called arachnoid trabeculae. And in around this, there is what we call a subarachnoid space. So underneath arachnoid matter, and that subarachnoid space can be filled with cerebral spinal fluid, CSF. And that subarachnoid space, again, is going to be kind of in between arachnoid matter and then our outermost, which is going to be dura. Dura matter is the outermost. It's very tough, okay? There is an epidural space, okay, between dura matter and the skull bones, okay? We will see this epidural space as well when we're looking at the spinal cord. That might be where a woman who is pregnant gets an epidural. And this dura mater is very protective. It has two layers, okay, a meningeal layer and a periosteal layer. Periosteal meaning it's going to be touching the bone, and meningeal meaning it's touching the other meninges, like arachnoid matter. And these are our pictures here, okay? So this light pinkish purple actually touching the brain, okay, is pia. We have arachnoid matter in here, right? We can see part of the subarachnoid space. We can see those projections, okay? Then up here, we have dura matter. And again, dura matter, we're going to see it touching the skull bones. In addition to these protective membranes, we also have spaces within the brain or cavities, which are called ventricles, okay? These ventricles are lined with another one of our neuroglial cells called ependymal cells. They regulate the composition of cerebral spinal fluid, and cerebral spinal fluid is the fluid that flows through these ventricles. We have different types of ventricles, okay? There's 4 of them. There's 2 lateral ones, which kind of go within the cerebral hemispheres, one on one side, one on the other. And again, these are just spacious cavities that cerebral spinal fluid flows through. They are separated by a tissue partition called septum pellucidum. That is what separates these 2 lateral ventricles. They're also called lateral horns, which you'll see when we get it to a picture. Around diencephalon, we have a cavity called third ventricle, and it is connected to the lateral ventricles through a hole called interventricular foramen. Then around the brainstem, pons, and cerebellum, okay, we have the fourth ventricle, and it is connected to third ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct, which is going to be a very long canal. Eventually, these ventricles will deliver cerebral spinal fluid to the spinal cord through the central canal. This is what they look like. Again, they are colored in blue to show the cerebral spinal fluid flowing through them, but these are just empty cavities within the brain. We have our 2 lateral horns here, okay? Right here we have a hole, interventricular foramen, leading to third ventricle. We have a canal here, which is called cerebral aqueduct, leading to fourth ventricle, and then eventually we make it to the central canal of the spinal cord. This is how cerebral spinal fluid flows through the brain structures in order to be a nutritive substance to the brain tissue. Cerebral spinal fluid itself is clear and colorless, okay? It circulates in the ventricles. It also goes into the meninges, right? We have some going into subarachnoid space. It has many functions. It's protective, okay? It allows buoyancy. It allows environmental stability, so homeostasis for a number of our different tissues in the brain. There is a specific group of cells that actually produces cerebral spinal fluid, and this is called choroid plexus. And there are choroid plexi on each ventricle, okay, producing cerebral spinal fluid. And then we know that we have these ependymal cells come into play that are going to regulate what they're making. All right, just showing a picture of what choroid plexus looks like. That is the group of cells that produce cerebral spinal fluid. Additionally, okay, we have the blood-brain barrier, and I really only wanted to focus on one aspect of the blood-brain barrier, which are these astrocytes, one of our neuroglia. And we know that astrocytes are essentially connecting neurons to a blood supply. We've seen this, and how they do this is by using these perivascular feet that allow them to attach to the capillaries and create junctions. We can kind of see that here. So we see these perivascular feet that are attaching, okay, taking in different nutrients and delivering them to the neurons. And these are part of what make up our blood-brain barrier. Let's move into some of the brain structures, okay? So first we have cerebrum. And it is the origin of all complex intellectual functions. Okay, cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, and we're going to see the different functions simply based on what lobe associations we have when we get there. It is considered the center of intelligence and reasoning, thought, memory, and judgment, voluntary control of muscle, and conscious perception for our senses. As we spoke of before, there is a left and right hemisphere for cerebrum, which we call our cerebral hemispheres. And in between them, there is a fissure. So that's a deep sulcus called longitudinal fissure. And these two hemispheres, they still communicate with each other, even though there is a fissure in between them. And how they communicate is through attractive axons called corpus callosum. And that connects these two hemispheres. Each hemisphere, interestingly enough, interacts with the opposite side of the body, okay? So the left hemisphere receives signals from the right side of the body and vice versa. The right hemisphere receives signals from the left side. So this is kind of a cross communication going on with these. What we often see with certain higher order functions, so this would be complex thought, planning, things like that, there's something called cerebral lateralization, where these kinds of higher order functions are controlled by only one side of the brain versus the other. An example of this might be speech, which is primarily controlled with the left cerebral hemisphere. Right, just looking at pictures here. We're going to get into our lobe associations eventually, but right now we have left and right hemispheres, longitudinal fissure. There is that connection in between them, which we'll see when we see half of a brain called corpus callosum. And let's get into some of those lobe features. There are 5 lobes. 4 of them are named for the cranial bones that they sit underneath. So we have the frontal lobe, which sits underneath the frontal bone, parietal lobes sitting underneath the parietal bones, temporal lobe sitting underneath the temporal bones, and occipital lobe sitting underneath the occipital bone. Inside all of these lobes, there's an innermost one called the insula or insular lobe. For frontal lobe, okay, and I'll go back to this picture real quick. We've got frontal lobe, both left and right, okay, in that yellowish orange. They have what we call a central sulcus, okay? And I'm just going to kind of show you that here. So we have a central sulcus, and it's separating frontal lobe from parietal lobe. And we actually have a lot of names and functions for every single gyrus that we see in front of or behind the central sulcus, but we're not going to get into that for this particular class. The frontal lobe has a variety of functions, okay? Its functions include motor control, concentration, verbal communication, decision-making, planning, and personality. People who are in car accidents or motorcycle accidents and they have sustained damage to their frontal lobe, they are going to lack motor control. They might have complete personality changes, and they might change their decision-making and their complex thought processes. Parietal lobe, okay, that we see next. This one, again, we have certain gyri that sit behind it. We're not going to go super into that. Its main functions that we look at, okay, are involving sensory functions. And a lot of what the parietal lobe deals with is our sense of touch. It's called our somatosensory system. And so it can be used for evaluating shape and texture of objects. Someone who's suffering a stroke, who has damage to the parietal lobe, they may lose this ability to identify objects by touch. The temporal lobe, a little bit different, it's on the sides. It functions for our hearing and our sense of smell. And the occipital lobe in the back, it has everything to do with vision, okay? So functions for vision as well as visual memories. Insula, which is the deepest, functions with memory as well as our sense of taste. Those are some lobe functions, which we will look at associations in addition to these. As far as motor areas go, okay, we were looking at the frontal lobe as having partial role in motor control. In the frontal lobe, we have our primary motor cortex, which is part of this, what we call precentral gyrus. This is one of the gyri, which is sitting in front of central sulcus as part of our frontal lobe. And essentially, it's going to control motor function, right? We do know that we have different hemispheres, so control of skeletal muscle is opposite on the side of the body, right? So left side controls right, right side controls left. And don't worry about this motor homunculus. We're not going to focus on that for today. But again, frontal lobe is associated with this primary motor cortex for movement. In addition, okay, and this is not just on the frontal lobe, but we might see a few other areas, okay, for motor things. We have a motor speech area, so not just controlling movement of skeletal muscle that would move our body, but skeletal muscle that would move our mouth so we can produce speech. This is found in Broca's area, which is part of the frontal lobe on the left side for most people and helps with movements for vocalization of those skeletal muscles. Also, kind of in between lobes, there's a frontal eye field. This is for regulating eye movements with those skeletal muscles. And then we have a premotor cortex, which goes in front of our primary motor cortex. And this is helping with coordination of learned and skilled activities involving skeletal muscle. So this is that muscle memory. For some sensory areas, and keep track of what lobe we're on in here, we have a primary visual cortex. And remember, anything with vision is the occipital lobe. So this visual association area, also associated with the occipital lobe. Our auditory functions go with temporal lobe, so we can have a primary auditory cortex for processing sound information, as well as an association area where we integrate and interpret what those sounds are, both associated with the temporal lobe. For smell, we have the primary olfactory cortex, also present in the temporal lobe. And then for our sense of taste, gustatory cortex, this is found within insula for the sense of taste. Let's look at some functional areas as well. Again, this is a lot. I would suggest making note cards for these associated with each lobe. For the prefrontal cortex, okay, this is associated in the frontal lobe, and this is where we get our stuff for complex thought, judgment, personality, planning, and decision making. This prefrontal area is still developing in adolescence. Wernicke's area is a little bit different, usually associated with the left hemisphere, not quite a lobal association, and this is involved with our ability to comprehend language. Typically, Wernicke's area is around temporal and parietal lobes, that barrier. For that lateralization that we mentioned before, remembering that each side exhibits different functions, right? We saw that left side is mostly associated with speech. We can actually put our hemispheres into different categories using this cerebral lateralization. We could have a categorical hemisphere, which is usually the left hemisphere, specialized for language, categorizing things, analysis, containing speech areas as well as language understanding areas like the Wernicke area. And then we have another lobe, our other side, which is representational hemisphere, usually considered the right hemisphere, concerned with visuospatial relationships, imagination, comparison of senses, the arts, your creative side associated with the right hemisphere or your representational hemisphere. And each of these, again, communicate with each other through corpus callosum. As far as lateralization goes, okay, so over time we develop these. It develops in early childhood, usually seen by ages 5 to 6, okay? It can be different depending on sex, okay? So corpus callosum, that connection between the hemispheres, tends to be thicker in women versus in men. And lateralization also contributes to certain genetic traits that we see, such as handedness. Handedness meaning whether you use your right hand or your left hand as your dominant hand. Those who use their right hand, they are almost always left hemisphere dominant, okay, and speech, and that comes along with being speech dominant and categorical. Left-handed individuals may use either hemisphere, but could be associated as right dominant. Let's move into diencephalon, okay, which is comprised of three main areas: epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. Remember, diencephalon is the center area of the brain. In case you were wondering what corpus callosum looks like, this is that structure right here, connecting those two hemispheres. For the epithalamus, we have two main structures, the pineal gland and the hibernular nuclei, also called the hibernacula. Don't worry about these nuclei. Focus on the pineal gland. It is a gland that produces melatonin, which regulates our circadian rhythm, which is our wakefulness and sleepfulness cycles. Okay, so when you go to bed and when you wake up. Pineal gland is the main structure for the epithalamus, and I'm going to show you what that is real quick. Epithalamus is part of this structure here, ending with the pineal gland. Kind of goes over like this. The thalamus itself, okay, is a larger structure, and I'll point it out real quick. Thalamus and hypothalamus is going to be down here. For the thalamus, okay, it contains a number of different thalamic nuclei. And remember, that term nuclei just means neuron cell bodies all clustered together. And its main purpose, okay, don't worry about this interthalamic adhesion, its main purpose is to receive signals from all conscious senses except olfaction. So whenever we are doing vision, right, one of our senses, whenever we are doing touch, one of our senses, when we do hearing, when we do taste, all of those from their neurons get processed by the thalamus and then sent to different parts of the cortex for interpretation. The only one that doesn't go through the thalamus is your sense of smell. This is our thalamus. You do not have to know all the nuclei, just its general function. For the hypothalamus, it is actually a different kind of organ. It does neurological things, but it also produces hormones, which you'll learn about in part 2 of A&P. The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland through a stalk called infundibulum. And basically for the hypothalamus, it regulates homeostasis in the body. It controls autonomic nervous system function, so influences heart rate, blood pressure, digestive activities, breathing, respiration. It controls the endocrine system by producing hormones. It regulates body temperature. And again, it is insightful for when we get fevers. It regulates how much food we take in, how much water we take in. It can have effects on the pineal gland, so our sleep and wakefulness rhythms. It also can regulate emotional behavior. The hypothalamus is controlling many things in the body, so we would generally say that it is controlling homeostasis. Moving to the brainstem. The brainstem is comprised of the midbrain pons and medulla oblongata. And you do not have to know all the nuclei for these as well, okay? Just taking a note of that. So we have the midbrain pons and medulla oblongata in this picture, okay? Midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. For the midbrain, okay, there's a number of structures here. We have cerebral peduncles, we have lemniscus, which are just myelinated axon tracts, but specifically, okay, we have this substantia nigra, okay? This is a darkened area of the midbrain due to the cells, the neurons there produce melanin, and they house neurons that produce dopamine, okay? Dopamine is a modulator, it's a neurotransmitter that is going to control some aspects of movement, and oftentimes we see damage to the substantia nigra in the midbrain in Parkinson's disease, meaning that those cells are not producing dopamine, causing irregular movements in someone who suffers from Parkinsonism. Additional structures for the midbrain, we have something called tegmentum, which is containing our red nuclei, which we won't get too much into, but it also contains a group of structures called the reticular formation. The reticular formation we will look at in a later slide has to do with our arousal or our consciousness, okay? Reticular formation is what allows us to go to sleep and then come back into consciousness. If there are effects to this reticular formation, someone might be in a coma. Cerebral aqueduct, this is a structure we already mentioned that is bringing cerebral spinal fluid from third ventricle to fourth ventricle. And then we have an area called tectum. And tectum is also called corpora quadrigemina, if you see it in other texts. And these different structures called colliculi are going to control visual reflexes as well as auditory reflexes. For pons, okay, and what we're going to focus on pons is just this respiratory center. Pons is the next structure, and it has a respiratory center, meaning it's going to control some aspect of breathing. It helps regulate skeletal muscles for breathing. That is all you need to know for pons. The last structure is medulla oblongata, oftentimes in the text just referred to as medulla. This is continuous with the spinal cord, okay? So if you sever your medulla oblongata or damage it, this is likely going to cause death because this is your connection of your brain to the rest of your nervous system. Some features, okay, that we see with the medulla, it has these tracts, which we call pyramids. It has these olives or like bulges, and it has these peduncles connecting it to a number of different structures. Some of the main purposes of medulla oblongata, though, are going to be these cardiovascular and respiratory centers. Cardiovascular center is going to regulate the heart's cardiac output. It also has a vasomotor center, which is going to control blood vessel diameter for increasing or decreasing blood pressure. Just like pons, there's also a medullary respiratory center from medulla oblongata that controls the breathing rate. Moving on to cerebellum, and I know I went through those quickly. This is because we don't have a lot of material that you do have to know for the brain stem or for certain structures. I just want you to know the basic function. For cerebellum, this is our last structure in the brain. It's the second largest area. This sits underneath or inferior to the occipital lobe. And we have a number of different features. And what we're going to focus on for cerebellum are these ones down here. We have the cerebellar cortex, the outside made with gray matter. We have arbor vitae, the inside made with white matter. And then we have a number of different nuclei present in cerebellum. So the purpose or function of cerebellum is to coordinate fine-tune movements. This has to do with posture and your ability to balance, your coordination. So this ensures that muscle activity follows a correct pattern. It stores memories of previously learned movements. It regulates activity along voluntary and involuntary muscle tracts. It adjusts movements, ensuring that they're smooth, okay? It helps maintain equilibrium and posture. That's the big one. And it is helpful in our motor plans and receiving sensory feedback. So when we walk, we all have a certain gait, okay? We have a balanced way that we walk. Someone with issues with their cerebellum may not have a very steady gait because they're not coordinated. Another system that we're not going to go too deep into is the limbic system, okay? This is considered your emotional brain. Anytime you think of an emotional response that is evoked from any kind of sensory stimuli, we think of the limbic system, which is found in a number of different areas. One structure I want us to focus on is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is helping us form long-term memories, and it is considered part of the limbic system. The reticular formation, also part of the limbic system, and we can see this kind of come up. Remember, reticular formation has to do with our alertness or awareness to certain sensations, and it is necessary for consciousness. So our reticular formation kind of backs off when we go into deep sleep cycles. And then when we are awake, we have full consciousness and our reticular formation is quite active. As far as emotion goes, we know this is associated with the limbic system. In addition, we have a structure called our amygdala, or in this case for your book, your amygdaloid body, same thing as amygdala. And this is going to be kind of another area where we have emotional responses, the amygdala. And typically with the amygdala, it is a fear response. Last kind of section I think that we're going to go over for this chapter is the cranial nerves, and you do need to know the cranial nerves and their functions, okay? There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They are named with Roman numerals, but they also have names relating to their function, okay? You do need to know both. So these are what our cranial nerves look like. We'll be looking at them in lab as well. Most of the nerves anatomically sit around the brain stem, with some of them going up into these lobe areas. We'll start with cranial nerve number 1. This is your olfactory nerve. It is primarily a sensory nerve, and it functions for your sense of smell. Cranial nerve number 2. This is going to be our optic nerve, and we can kind of see them coming from the eye in this picture, crossing over each other, forming optic chiasm. They are a sensory nerve as well for vision. We're going to start getting into those nerves that sit around the brain stem. The first one is cranial nerve number 3, which is your oculomotor nerve. Think about that word, oculomotor. Oculo meaning eye, motor meaning muscle movement. And so this is one of those nerves that innervates control of muscles to move the eye, lift the eyelid, and change the lens shape. I am putting special focus on this because the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 3, is not the only nerve that moves muscles of the eye, which we'll look at. This next nerve also does this. This is cranial nerve number 4, trochlear nerve, and it controls a specific muscle of the eye, which is the superior oblique eye muscle. And we can see that right here. Cranial nerve number 5 is your trigeminal nerve. It does have 3 branches, okay, which is where it gets that tri from. It is considered a mixed nerve. So what we were looking at before, our first 2 nerves, olfactory and optic, those are sensory nerves, so they bring in sensory information, but they don't control movement, right? These other ones, oculomotor and trochlear, these are primarily motor, okay, so they're sending motor signals out to muscles. This one here is our first mixed nerve, okay, and this mixed nerve has both sensory and motor function. The 3 branches, which give it its name, trigeminal, those are sensory branches. So they receive a number of sensations from the face. And then our motor function is it controls muscles needed for chewing, or what we would call mastication. Cranial nerve number 6 is called abducens. This is our last nerve that controls muscles of the eye. It is a motor nerve, and it controls a specific muscle called lateral rectus on the outside of the eye. Cranial nerve number 7 is your facial nerve. It is a mixed nerve, which means it has both sensory and motor function. It controls muscles for facial expression. That's its motor function. But its sensory function is that it has taste sensations from the tongue. Cranial nerve number 8 is your vestibulocochlear nerve, also called your auditory nerve, if you want to learn it that way. This is a sensory nerve. This is for your sense of hearing, as well as your sense of equilibrium or balance when your head is moving. Cranial nerve number 9 is your glossopharyngeal nerve. That word glosso is tongue, and pharyngeal means your throat, your pharynx. This is also a mixed nerve, so both motor and sensory function. For that sensory function, it receives taste and touch from the tongue. For the motor function, is it controls muscles in the throat or the pharynx. Cranial nerve number 10 is your vagus nerve. This is kind of a weird nerve that has a lot of functions. It's a mixed nerve, so it has both sensory and motor function. For its motor function, it can control muscles in the pharynx, your throat, and your larynx, your voice box. For sensation, it can get all kinds of sensory information from your internal organs called your viscera, which is why you see a number of internal organs in this picture. Cranial nerve number 11 is your accessory nerve. It used to be called the spinal nerve, but it also innervates muscles in the head as well as the neck. So it is a motor nerve, okay? So it is controlling muscles in the neck as well as the pharynx, the throat, accessory nerve. Your last one, which is cranial nerve 12, is your hypoglossal nerve. Again, we see that word gloss for tongue, and it is a motor nerve that controls the muscles of the tongue. That is it for chapter 13. Okay, these are our cranial nerves. I'm going to go ahead and do chapter 14 as well. So let me stop sharing and I will do chapter 14. All right, I'm going to share my screen for chapter 14. All right, chapter 14 is a bit shorter. If you are watching this continuously, maybe go take a break and come back. All righty, so we will continue. Chapter 14. This is looking at the spinal cord. So definitely if you felt a little overwhelmed with the brain, maybe take a break and come back. We're going to look at just a few things with the spinal cord specifically. This is a link between the brain and the rest of the body. And a lot of times what we do with the spinal cord is more simplistic than how we process things in the brain. And this simplicity is called spinal reflexes. We don't really involve the brain in this process, but we have a fast reaction to certain stimuli. The spinal cord itself is running through your vertebral canal between those vertebrae. And at the end, it forms kind of a taper, which we call cona medullaris. Coming from cona medullaris, we are going to see another structure, okay, which we call cauda equinus, which we'll look at a little later. Typically, the spinal cord is shorter than the vertebral column, so it's not going to go all the way to your tailbone. And we are going to see those spinal nerves branching off of there. There are four main portions of the spinal cord. We have a cervical region in the neck, a thoracic region around the rib cage, lumbar region in the lower back, and a sacral region in the sacral area. There is kind of a grouping of them that we call a cervical enlargement and a lumbar enlargement in certain regions. This is kind of what it looks like, okay? And subsequently from those areas, we are going to have branching nerves named for those areas. A nerve is just a cable-like bundle of axons. So we know the cell bodies exist in the spinal cord, and the axons are going to make up these nerves as part of the peripheral nervous system. There are 31 spinal nerves, okay, that branch off of these different areas of the spinal cord. And I want to make sure I note this, okay? Cervical region, right, in the neck. Thoracic region, right around where the rib cage is. Lumbar region, lower back, and then sacral region down here where the sacrum and coccyx are. So we're going to look at the anatomy of the spinal cord. That's the main focus of this lecture, okay? We're not going to really focus on the types of spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs of them. They are all mixed nerves, meaning they have both a sensory and a motor function. We are going to look at some groupings of these nerves, which we call plexi, but that will be at the end of this lecture. So let's look at the spinal cord itself, okay? We have these small structures, which we call rootlets, okay, which will eventually form the different roots that we're going to see, making up the first portion of our spinal nerves. And we'll look at a picture of that so you're aware of what that looks like. So these are rootlets. There's our spinal cord itself, which we're going to look at those structures. But before we get there, we have these rootlets branching off. And we have a posterior root and an anterior root eventually coming together so that we form our spinal nerve. Cauda equina is that one structure I mentioned again that is at the bottom. Cauda equina means horsetail, and it kind of looks like a horsetail of nerves basically coming out of the bottom of the spinal cord. As far as what houses the spinal cord, before we get into its main structures, it sits within the vertebral column, right, in the vertebral canal. And again, the vertebral column is all of our vertebrae, right? Those bones protecting. We also have meninges. And these are the same meninges, okay? So this is not going to be different from the brain. We have pia mater touching the spinal cord. You do not have to know these terms. You have arachnoid mater, which is the next layer with that subarachnoid space. And then you have dura mater, which is the outermost one. And we have these subdural as well as epidural spaces. Again, same meninges as around the brain. And we have kind of a little cross section here. The meninges are not super well articulated in this picture, but we are going to transition to look at what all these structures are in the spinal cord. Here's our meninges, okay? Dura, arachnoid, and then we have pia touching. So within our spinal cord, we have these horns, which are making up gray matter. What's interesting about gray matter in the spinal cord is it's not like in the brain where it sits on the outside in the cortex. It actually sits in the center of the spinal cord, which you can see in these pictures, right? So we can see gray matter on the inside and white matter on the outside. This is the opposite of the brain. And these horns that I'm talking about, which we can see in this picture, got a horn here, and horn here on each side. These are areas of gray matter housing different types of neurons. The posterior horns in the back, they are going to be housing sensory neurons. So they're bringing in sensory information. Posterior horns being right here. Okay, these two horns. Posterior horns have sensory neurons. The anterior and lateral horns both house motor neurons. They house different types of motor neurons, but for our information today, just motor neurons. So the anterior, which is up here, and the lateral coming out of the side, those horns house motor neurons. This is how we can have a mixed spinal nerve with both sensory and motor functions. In between all of these horns is an area called gray commissure, which surrounds the central canal, which is a hole in the middle of the spinal cord, allowing cerebral spinal fluid to flow through. As far as these nuclei or group cell bodies go, again, I just want you to associate them with a horn. Sensory nuclei or sensory neurons are in the posterior horn. Motor nuclei or motor neurons are found in the anterior and lateral horns. When we do this separation for types of motor neurons, somatic ones are going to innervate skeletal muscle. This is conscious control. Autonomic ones, this is going more towards internal organs or glands. It's going to innervate smooth muscle, the heart, and other glands. It's just kind of a picture showing that separation, okay, but whether we're doing sensory versus motor. We also have different areas where we might feel pain or sensations coming from one spinal nerve, but shows up in other areas. These are called dermatomes, okay? So a part of the skin that is supplied by a single spinal nerve, but sometimes when we have damage to certain internal organs, we can actually manifest that sensation on the skin, on that dermatome. This process is called referred pain or referred visceral pain. An example of this is when the appendix is in pain, okay? It might express that pain on the skin to where you feel pain in this T10 dermatome, which hopefully I kept the picture. Yes. This T10 dermatome is right here in that kind of thoracic trunk region. So even though the pain is present in the appendix, which is an internal organ, it expresses itself on the surface of the skin. This is because they all follow a single tract or single spinal nerve, and that's where we get these dermatomes. A really good example of another dermatome is when the heart feels pain. And when you have a heart attack, oftentimes people might complain of heart pain, but more often than not, they're going to complain of pain or numbness in their left side of their body, their left arm, their left side of their face, their left part of their neck. And that is also a dermatome, okay? And these dermatomes are just showing us areas where we can see referred visceral pain. We're going to look at these nerve plexuses now. So this is groupings of nerves. We're not learning all the spinal nerves, but we're learning their groupings, these plexi that they have. There are four main ones. We have a cervical one coming from those cervical nerves. We have a brachial one from that brachial area, the arms, lumbar, lower back, and sacral towards that pelvic region. For the cervical plexus, okay, and what you need to know is what this innervates. So these branches innervate anterior neck muscles, skin of the neck, and portions of the head and shoulders, okay? So neck area for cervical. just a picture. And there are a number of branches that come out of this, okay? Axillary going towards the armpits, okay? It will innervate the deltoid muscles, teres major muscles, armpit muscles, that type of thing. We have a median one, which goes kind of in the middle of the forearm, innervating parts of the forearm. Musculocutaneous goes to the front muscles of the arm. And then the radial and ulnar nerves go to muscles in the forearm where the radius and the ulna would be. And again, sorry about that. We have switched to the brachial plexus. Cervical is just with the neck. Brachial plexus has to do with our different branches to the arm. Lumbar plexus, lower back, and we have a few nerves coming off of this. Lumbar plexus has the femoral nerve going to muscles and areas of the femur, the thigh. Obturator nerve is kind of the inner medial thigh, right where you might see gracilis or a few other muscles. Sacral plexus has a little bit of different innervation. We have our largest nerve in the body, the sciatic nerve, coming from here, and it will break down into two divisions, our tibial and common fibular division, going to innervate different parts of the leg. Tibial nerve is going to innervate the hamstrings. Common fibular is going to go to certain parts of the hamstrings as well, like biceps femoris. They can branch even further into fibular nerves, which go to different parts of the leg. Don't worry about this slide. Lastly, I just wanted to mention reflexes because I do on your exam want you to kind of be aware of the events that lead to a reflex, which is primarily what our spinal nerves do, reflexes. These are rapid, pre-programmed, involuntary responses to muscles or glands when they receive a stimulus. So the stimulus is required to initiate the reflex. The reflex will be fast and involuntary. You can think of your reflex like when you go to the doctor, right, and you get your knee hit and your knee kicks up. That is a pre-programmed involuntary reflex due to a stimulus, a doctor putting pressure on part of your knee. Reflexes are survival mechanisms so that you can move your body part away from something that might be considered detrimental. This is our reflex arc, okay? We have a specific pathway that we follow, and I do want you to know this picture, okay? Step number one, stimulus activates the receptor, okay? In this case, a nail into the skin. Step number two, the nerve signal is propagated through the sensory neuron, right? We're going to the back, right? Where we have those posterior horns, sensory neuron. Go into the spinal cord. Three, the nerve signal is processed for integration. Four, the nerve signal is propagated to the motor neuron, from the motor neuron to the effector. Okay, so we have the motor neuron sending a signal away, and the effector responds. If my hand went on a nail, my motor neuron is sending me a signal to move my hand away, right, using my arm muscle. This is our reflex arc, and I want you to know the steps of this for this neural pathway, just based off these numbers. All right, that is it for chapters 13 and 14. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have additional questions. Anything that it seems like I may have skipped over on the slides and specifically didn't talk about is likely not going to be on the test. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know.